niin kuin mä olin just äsken sanomassa sulle, niin mä oon sitä, ai niin, nyt mä oon lähetyksessä. Tää jää sitten myöhemmäksi tää tarina. Moi Nupsteri, mikä meininki?
Hyvä meininki, tiedätkö mitä?
No.
Kun sä olit eilen silleen, että sä haluaisit sen pelituolin.
Joo.
Niin arvaa, mitä mä ajattelin.
No.
Me voitais nyt järjestää tähän ne lanit, ja sitten me voitais ottaa sitten se kuva, niin sitten sä voisit osallistua siihen kilpailuun, että voisit sä niinku voittaa sen tuoli.
Joo.
Ja sitten tiedätkö mitä? Kaverille kans. Sitten jos me voitetaan, niin sitten mäkin saan sen tuolla.
Okei, että ei silleen, että mulla on se maanantaisia, tiistaisia, torstaisia ja sitten sulla on loppuviikosta. Ei silleen.
Ei silleen. No niin, ootko nyt valmis?
Mä oon valmis.
Tässä, kato, onko tässä meidän lanikone?
On.
Tää on nyt valmiina.
On.
Onks niinku...
Mä oon mobiililla.
Sä oot nyt mobiililla. Onko meillä niinku nyt herkut kunnossa?
On.
Onko meillä valoja?
On kaikki.
Mitä kaikkea pitää olla kotilaneilla? On niinku...
Reinot.
Assyhenki, meininki. Jee! Ja sitten otetaan kuva.
Hyvä.
No niin, hyvä.
No niin, toi on ihan selkeästi et nyt kannattaa oikeasti pistää paraksi, koska toi oli sen verran hyvä kuva, että pitää oikeasti satsata, että päihittää.
Niinpä, mutta mä voin näyttää, kuulkaa, jos mä saan vähän kuvaa taas tästä mun tietokoneruudusta, koska mä oon selvästikin tää tyyppi, joka tulee aina tänne surffailemaan.
Joo, aina mäkkiskaan silleen, että nyt toimii.
Niin mä voisin näyttää nyt täältä sivulta, että mistä voi osallistua tuohon kotilanikisaan.
Joo.
Eli meillä on tää tämmönen kisasivu. Ja siitä kisasivulta kun klikkaa, niin täällä on oikeastaan kaikki kisat, mihin tällä hetkellä voi osallistua. Ja sitten tämä meidän kotilanin kisa on ihan täällä toisiksi viimeisenä. Täältä löytyy parhaat kotilanit ja sieltä kun klikkailee, niin kato
siellä
sitten.
Siellä näkyy voittajakuva, eli meidän.
Niin sittenhän tänne voi laittaa kuvaa menemään ja sitten voi osallistua kisaan. Eli jos jollain on nyt parempi kuva kuin meillä, niin sitten kannattaa ehkä laittaa kuvaa menemään, koska siellä on tosiaan ne ihan messevät tuolit jaossa.
Meillä on tuossa Bäckärillä on kanssa nuo Leetin pelituolit, niin pakko ihan tälleen ei-kaupallisessa yhteistyössä niin sanoa, että on muuten älyttömän mukavat tuolit. Ja siis pysyy niinku ryhti. Itse asiassa olisi voinut olla täälläkin, koska tää ei ole siis rehellisesti niinku mitenkään kauhean mukava tää tuoli. Mä vähän istun täällä. Jos mä näytän että mä röhnötän, niin se johtuu tästä tuolista. Eli Leetin pelituoli tänne, niin sitten mäkin istun jatkossa. No niin, hyvä.
Niinpä. Mutta hei, täällä on kaikkea muitakin hauskoja pelejä, mitä mä ajattelin, että me voitaisiin nyt kokeilla pelata. Täällä olisi esimerkiksi nyt, kuulkaa, onnenpyörä. Ja
onnenpyörä.
Ja jos tätä haluaa pelata, niin siihen tarvitsee tällaisen koodin. Ja sen saa, kun hakee täältä sivuvalikosta noi liput, niin jokainen voi sitä kautta saada itselleen myös sellaisen koodin, jolla voi pelata.
Eli tässä vaiheessa pitää olla sisäänlogattuna vai onko nämä niinku yleisesti tolleen vaan?
Eikö tosta just kun sä tuolta loggaat sisään, niin sitten pitäisi...
Niin sit löytyy sieltä.
Joo. Painan. Kyllä olen lukenut säännöt. Katsotaan, lähteekö tämä nyt pelaamaan.
Kukaan ei lue noita sääntöjä, mutta ne on siellä kuitenkin. Oho! Oi!
Niin? No, oot sä nyt valmis?
On.
Start the wheel.
Start the wheel.
Nyt onks mä nyt lanihenki?
On, nyt on lanihenki. 3, 2. Okei, nyt meni jo. Ei, tähti.
Mitä tää tarkoittaa? Harmin paikka.
Rosvosektori. Vietiks kaikki meidän rahat nyt?
No mulla ei aika paljon mitä viedä.
Mulla oli kyllä lompakko tässä taskussa, mutta ei kerrota kellekään.
Mahtavaa. Okei, no eli siellä on tommonen onnenpyörä, mitä pystyy pelaamaan.
Joo.
Yes. Sitten
siellä voi oikeastikin voittaa jotain.
No voi oikeastikin voittaa jotain. Mä katselen, että täällä on jotain e-liigaa ja sitten tässä on joku 10. Pitäisikö voidaankohan me pyörittää vielä niinku uudestaan?
Niin saadaanko me niinku järjestäjänä pyörittää niinku kerran uudestaan?
Ei, kyllä ei. Tässä nyt tuntuu, että tää on vaan niinku yksi per...
Onko toi Seymour, sit se on varmaan joku niinku tommonen...
Seymour-paketti 2 kuukautta etukoodia. Tässä olisi niinku...
Aika jees.
Telia-kaupan lahjakortti. Sitten olisi Telia-pelipassi ja 4 kertaa Seymourin.
Kerropas, mikä on Telian pelipassi?
Hyvä kysymys.
Mä luulen, että sillä pääsee nappien, että mikä on Telian pelipassi kuulostaa. Mä jotenkin voin ymmärtää, että se liittyy tähän peliliigaan ja näin. Kun siinä on liigakuva, niin ehkä meidän kuulokkeeseen tai joku chatissa voi kertoa tietämättömille juontajille, että mikä on meidän yhteistyökumppaneiden tuotteet.
Ja hei, sitten täältä Expo-sivulta, jos klikkaa, niin täältä pääsee myös tänne F-Securen peliin. Täällä on myös aika hauska peli. Ja tässä oli mun mielestä aika kovat oli noi palkinnot. Mun mielestä tässä oli että Ootas nyt.
Palkintona
Missä se on? Kato, 10 parasta pelaajaa saa niinku F-Securen Total Premium Cyber Security Package. Et sitten olisi niinku tietoturva kunnossa. Mites sulla, Christopher, onko sun tietoturva kunnossa?
On. Mulla itse asiassa on toi Total.
Noniin, eli sitten mun kannattaa voittaa tää, koska sitten
Mutta kun on Mac, niin sit sitä ei ihan yhtä paljon tarvitse kuin jossain Windows-kone, mutta siinä on kuitenkin se VPN on tosi hyvä.
Niin, totta muuten.
Sehän kuuluu kans siihen. Jos muistan, kuuluu kans siihen, joo. Mutta on se hyvä muutenkin, että siis vaikka sulla on Mac, niin että on toi tietoturva ja virustorjunta ja kaikki nämä malvaret ja kaikki nämä kohdillaan, koska se on ilkeätä sit, jos lähtee yhtäkkiä. Tulee Matrix-koodia ja sitten kaikki sun PowerPointit on jossain muualla, missä niiden pitää olla.
Niin, joku varastaa mun PowerPointin. Mutta mua aina tämä identiteettivarkaus vähän kuumottaa jotenkin, että joku esiintyy minuna ja jotenkin pöllii kaikki mun tiedot. Niin,
kun se on nykyään niin nopeeta.
Niinpä.
Muistan joskus mun sisko menetti rahansa, kun oli oli Espanjassa matkoilla. Ja siellä joku oli sitten swipannut sen kortin ja sitten oli jotenkin niinku tietulleista päässyt nostaa rahaa. En tiedä, miten se tapahtui, mutta siellä oli niinku siis tuhansia, oli silloin varmaan kruunuja siihen aikaan, eli tuhansien eurojen arvosta. Rahaa oli poistettu tililtä ja sai sitten kuitenkin niinku luottokortilta takaisin. Et rahaa, joo, sitä monesti saa takaisin, mutta jos joku niinku esiintyy sinuna ja tekee sopimuksia ja näin sun nimiin, niin siinä voi tehdä aika paljonkin haittaa, koska monella ihmisellä, ja siis just se, että on niinku yksi salasana niinku kaikessa ja kaikissa jutuissa, ja jos se lähtee, niin sitten lähtee niinku kaikki. Et siinä voi olla aikamoinen vyyhti sitten selvitettävänä.
Niinpä. Mä kuulen nyt tätä F-Securen niinku high scoresia, niin täällä olisi niinku 294 olisi tää niinku keulilla, että mulla olisi tässä nyt aikamoinen työmaa sit hakata toi, niinku, koska jos mä haluaisin päästä tonne niinku 10 parhaan listalle, että mä saisin sen palkinnon, niin nyt pitäisi niinku aika hyvin pelaa.
Mistä saa pisteitä?
Mä näytän. Saadaanko me tää peli käyntiin? Katsotaanpas nyt. Vielä? Eli Level Europe. Missä on hakkerit?
Missä hakkerit?
Nyt mulla on muuten ihan surkea. Tästä tuossa on oikein hiiri.
Ai, tuolla pitää klikata noita.
Ei,
No et sä nyt olla voittanut.
No en todellakaan.
Eli
Your score,
nyt on niinku hiirikäsi, nopea hiirikäsi niinku merkkaa.
145. Pikkasen mä jäin vajaaksi tosta kuitenkin, että vähän olisi vielä pitänyt.
Mitäs muuta? Onko jotain kivaa vielä?
No täällä on, kato, tää välilehti, tää kisat, niin täällähän voi katsoa, että mitä kaikkea täältä löytyy. Mä klikkaan nyt tätä kisat-välilehteen, niin katsotaan, mitäs meillä on täällä käynnissä. Tuossa oli toi onnenpyörä, sitä me jo pyörittiin, jouduttiin valitettavasti rosvoseksi. Sitten hei, kato, TikTok-tanssihaastesta.
Näkyykö siellä JPn videoita jo?
Mä en muuten itse asiassa tiedä.
Siis JPhän lupasi eilen, eikö niin, että hän tekee meille TikTokkiin
ei ole vielä tänne.
Tanssivideot.
Mutta hei, sit on meemikisa. Eikö nämä ole kuitenkin aika hauskoja?
On.
Eli tänne voisi lähettää omat.
Aha.
Tänne voisi
toivottavasti laatu on pikkasen parempi kuin toikin ihan kiva.
Niinpä. Yes. Sitten on toi kotilaanikisa, mihin me äsken otettiin kuva. Ja sitten sen lisäksi on vielä, kato, paras konepaikkakisa. Eli sitten jos ei ole laneja, missä on niinku useampi henkilö, niin sitten voi ottaa ihan siitä omasta konepaikasta tai omasta kotipisteestä foton ja sitten
mun mielestä on niin siistiä, että jengi
sillä
nykyään satsaa noihin niinku konepaikkoihin. Niinku himassakin tekee niinku smoothia cable management systeemejä ja ennen vanhaa oli silleen, että tyyliin oli yksi tuuletin ja sitten joku yksi ehkä valo. Ja sitten oli toi CD-aseman niin levy, niin siihen pystyi pistämään kahvikupin. Se oli niinku about siinä. Mutta nykyään mä tsiikaan aika paljon YouTubesta just tämmöisiä rakenteluvideoita ja lainastekstiä.
Palanko oot silleen niinku miettiä, että et sä nyt oikeasti niin vanha voi olla, kun sä puhutaan aina noista niinku vanhoista ajoista, että niinku kauan tästä on niinku oikeasti aikaa. Et kuinka paljon niinku teknologia on mennyt eteenpäin siitä? Mä
oon kuitenkin syntynyt 70-luvulla.
Aivan.
Mä tiedän, mä näytän niin...
Sä oot niin fresh.
Niin nuoria, että mä juon kato paljon vettä.
palaudut, keskityt
näin mä
uneen.
palaudun, näin mä kuuntelen Juha Jota just silleen. Koska siis onhan tääkin siis tapahtuma-ala ja tällaiset lähetykset ja näin, niin ne on tietynlaisia suorituksia, tietynlaisia urheilusuorituksia. Pitää oikeasti levätä hyvin. Nyt on tämmönen 5 päivää huomenna ja lauantaina te ette näe mua täällä, koska mä oon Biohacker Summitissa. Ja sieltä sitten tulee insertti tähän lähetykseen sitten lauantaina mahtavia juttuja. Esports-joukkue on siellä isolla lavalla pelaamassa ja koitetaan saada niin sykkeet näkyviin, että jengi niinku pystyy visuaalisesti näkemään, että hei, kun pelataan esportsia, Overwatchia korkealla tasolla, niin miten niinku rankka suoritus se oikeasti on. Käydään tutkailemaan siellä, että mitä kaikkea kivaa Biohacker Summitissa tapahtuu. Biohacker Summithan piti olla samassa paikassa kuin Assyt ja mahdollisesti jatkossakin voisi löytää jotain mielenkiintoisia yhtymäkohtia, koska monet biohakkerit on pelaajia ja monet pelaajat taas on biohakkereita, niin yritetään saada tavallaan tiivistetty nämä molemmat niinku yhteen. Niin hyvin mielenkiintoista. Siitä mä oon tosi pähkinöinen ja biohakkerille on tosi tärkeä tietenkin tämä palautuminen, mittaaminen, palautuminen ynnä muuta.
Mulla on siis tämä sormus ja mä en ole vielä tuossa biohacker-meiningissä niin syvällä, mutta mä oon kanssa kiinnittänyt huomioon siihen uneen ja palautumiseen niin kuin nyt viime aikoina. Ja se kyllä vaikuttaa musta elämänlaatuun aika paljon.
Tuossa oli edellisessä haastattelussa erittäin hyvin sanottu, että kyse ei ole vaan siitä peak performancesta, vaan se, että mikä sun niinku matalin taso on. Ja jos sä saat sen matalemman tason niinku nostettua, että sä et välillä niinku ihan huippu välillä ihan soossia, vaan jos sä oot niinku, se sun soossitasokin on niinku vähän korkeampi, niin se voi niinku merkittävästi jo parantaa sitä niinku suoritusta sun omalta osalta. Ja just se soossitaso tulee helposti siitä, että menee pelaa niinku 4 päivän lanien jälkeen tai ei ole nukkunut näitä. Jos ne perusasiat laittaa kuntoon, niin sitten ei tarvitse yhtä paljon keskittyä siihen niinku peak performance. Tietenkin sekin on tärkeää. Mutta se, että sä oot peak performance niinku, tilanteessa, niin se niinku rasittaa myös omalla tavalla.
Niinpä.
Yes, mahtavaa. Sitten meillä oli seuraavaksi Tampereen Pelimuseo yhteys.
Skrolli live, eikö niin?
Skrolli live. Mitäs Tampere? Kuuleeko Tampere? Katsotaan. Siellä on semmoinen mielenkiintoinen yhteys, että siellä on japanilaisia kotimikroja.
Toi kuulosti musta sairaan mielenkiintoiselta.
Mä mietin vaan, että onko tässä kotimikro, että käytetäänkö tässä nyt tämmöistä vanhaa sanontaa, että mikro on siis tietokone. Eli
mä luulen, että siellä ei ole sellaisia mikroja, missä lämmitetään ruokaa.
Tätä mä just mietin.
Tämä on vaan mun veikkaus, mutta voi olla, että mä oon ihan väärä.
Japanilaisista ei kyllä tiedä, että kotimikro voisi olla sellainen. Mutta sitten mä mietin, että jos se ei ole, että miksi se on sitten määritelty, että se on kotimikro. Onko se työmikro sitten erikseen?
Eikö ollut ennen oli tämä tavallaan kotitietokone, koska sitä ennen oli vaan ne semmoiset tietokoneet, mitkä oli niissä huoneissa ja sitten siellä jotenkin sitä käytettiin vaan jostain toimistolla ja sitten oli se suuri vallankumous, kun tietokone tuli kotiin.
Joo. Onko meillä yhteys valmiina, jatketaanko eteenpäin?
Halo.
We had the MSX2 from Sony, Philips, Panasonic, etc. To a limited extent. Then there was the Sharp MZ series, the MZ 700 and 800. And then some fairly obscure ones like the Sword M5, for example. And this list is far from exhaustive. There are much more, but these are just some of the ones that someone might recognize. But when we look at the machines that were only available in Japan, the list is much longer. So we have the MSX2 Plus standard, manufactured by Panasonic, for example. Then we have the Turbo R, also by Panasonic. I'm not going to talk about the MSX today, sorry guys, because it's a widely appreciated computer that has a major scene. I'm not that much into it, I'm not that familiar with it, because it has a very good group of users that keep its banner high. Then from NEC we had the PC 6000, the PC 6001, 8001, and then we had the 8800 and the 9800, or the PC 88 and PC 98 as they are commonly referred to. Those I will talk about today. Then from Fujitsu we have the FM8, the FM7, the FM77, the FM16, the FM Towns, the FMV Towns, and so on. I'll talk about the FM Towns briefly. From Sharp we had the MZ 1500 and 2500, in addition to the ones released in the West. These were much higher end computers, especially the 2500 was a very nice system that we never got. And of course the X1 and the X68000, which I will be covering. And like I said, this is the result of some hobbyist research. It's not an official canon of how things went, but I'll present to you 4 fascinating systems and show you some of their games on video and talk about them. Starting off with the PC-88, or the NEC PC-8801. Released in 1981, it had a Z80 compatible CPU at 4 MHz, 64 kilobytes of RAM, and then it came in 3 different versions. This was the V1 version, where they had a resolution of 640 by 200 with 8 fixed colors, or 640 by 400 with 2 colors, and just beep a sound. You'll notice that the resolution is kind of high compared to, for example, what we had, the Commodore 64 multicolor mode. I think it's 160 by 200 or something like that. The reason is that these computers were made to display the Japanese alphabet, the hiragana, katakana, and kanji. And these characters cannot really be displayed at very low resolution. And this is part of the reason why these computers developed in the direction they did. They started off with high resolution graphics for a specific need, and that's why it became sort of its own ecosystem. And so this was the initial release of the 8801, but it was not the initial computer from NEC. They had the PC-6000 and so on, even further back. But this was made for the home computer hobbyist enthusiast. They steadily upgraded the system. There were countless different models, but I've just picked 2 that were sort of remarkable. In 1985, they released the 8801 Mark II SR. And it came with V2 graphics, which means that now could display 8 colors out of a palette of 512, which made the color choices much nicer. And then there was a new high resolution mode also with 512 possible colors. And it added the Yamaha YN2203 OPM FM sound chip, just a mono sound, but anyway, an FM sound chip. And this was purely an upgrade to improve games and multimedia, if you will, because they had noticed that competitors were coming out with other products and they wanted to remain competitive, so they decided to upgrade the system. There was another update in 1988 called the PC-88 VA2, and it upgraded the CPU to 8 MHz, and it had 512 kilobytes of RAM, and it had V3 graphics with 65,000 and change colors, and you could have a very high resolution 256 color mode, and also upgraded the sound to FM stereo, added ADPCM. However, this system was not very popular. The PC-88 in itself was very popular. It sold a substantial number of machines, but the VA2 only had very limited software support, so it never became a major thing. So there are not many games for it, not a lot of software. The first video I have is from the game Bruce Lee, which some Commodore 64 people at least may recognize. And this is in the V1 graphics mode with the fixed palette of 8 colors. And you can see that, or possibly you cannot at the moment, but this is the loading screen, and it has a resemblance of Mr. Lee. But then you get to the gameplay itself, and you see that it's nothing really special. Maybe I'll fast forward a bit. You can see here the action is similar to the other 8-bit systems, and even the colors look nice, but you see this sort of pattern in the graphics, so they are spaced quite far between the lines, and this was also used to add more sense of color by means of dithering, and actually used some very nice effect. But anyway, the V1 games are rarer because it was not thought of as a game system, and anyway, games had not really picked up in 1981 yet, so it was not very common. Most of the games that were released for the PC-88, they run in V2 graphics mode. And I have an example that's going to get repeated. The famous space shooter Gradius. And this runs in V2 mode. And also you can see the keys over there. Very common that these were controlled via the keyboard with the number pad, and you use Z and X to fire. You had A and B. But you could also connect to the Mark II SR had a controller port for a 2-button joystick or joypad. But you can see that Gradius, it runs nice on the system. It's not super smooth because the hardware was not really designed for scrolling. It was more for displaying static images. What I will say is that the game is highly playable. It responds to your controls very quickly, and it might be sluggish on the outside, but it plays very well. Also, the FM sound is very nice. I didn't want to include it now because it will just mess up the audio, but I encourage you to take a listen. It sounds very good. And this is from 1986, so slightly later game, but after the release of the Mark II SR. And this was the lower end high volume computer in Japan at that time. Another example of V2 graphics, and also a common game, Makaimura or Ghosts and Goblins, which again C64 people may be familiar with. And here you can see also on the sides, you can see the line pattern. When I first saw this, I thought it was some sort of problem with my screen, but found out later that it's really supposed to be like that. There's a small space between the lines in graphics mode. But the game is exactly as unforgivingly hard on this system as it is on everything else. But runs nice, sounds okay, it's playable, but coming from the C64, for example, you can immediately see that this is not a very multimedia-oriented system, but rather the game features, they were added as an afterthought. But it didn't hurt sales in any way. This was a popular system. And these can still be had for reasonable money when you look at Yahoo Japan or Mercari or the local sites. They're not very expensive because they were very common. But the problem is that there are so many different versions, you need to know exactly what you are buying. I listed 3, but there are at least a dozen different ones, and they all have some sort of minute difference, and that of course relates to software compatibility and so on. So let's talk about the competition. And again, there's a notable omission that I'm making. I'm not going to talk about the Fujitsu FM7 and 77 because I don't have a system, and I like to talk about something I've experienced firsthand. But there was the Fujitsu systems, and there was the Sharp X1. And it was initially released in 1982. Came with a Z80, 4 MHz, 64 kilobytes of RAM, 320 by 200 or 640 by 200, 8 colors. PCG stands for Programmable Character Generator. And this relates to the way how Sharp handled graphics. So instead of having sprites or drawing sprites on the screen or having high screen graphics, you could redefine the character set. And you use that to produce your graphics. And actually the MZ700, 721 and so on that we had, even in Finland, it also used a character generator, but it couldn't be reprogrammed. Instead, they had a massive number of different characters in the ROM for example, racing games or whatnot. But the X1 had the more advanced system, which was also repeated in the 800 series of Sharp computers, where you could reprogram the character generator and then use that. Now, some of you might be asking, why did Sharp build 2 lines of computers? The answer is that Sharp was a big company, it still is, and they had 2 different product lines. They had the computer, the electronics line, and they had the television products line. And the X1 was the first terebi pasokon, so personal computer for television. And it linked up with the TV system, and you could use the monitor to watch TV, and you could overlay effects on it and so on. So it was sort of a parallel product line. And although the systems in terms of hardware, they are strikingly similar, there's no binary compatibility. So you cannot run X1 software on the MZ and vice versa, at least, well, barring some minor exceptions. But anyway, the software does not run. However, the design philosophy in both was very similar. Sharp used this very clean design where the system would only boot to a very minimal ROM, and then you would have to load whatever you liked after that. So there was no BASIC, no DOS, no CP/M. Whereas, for example, the PC-88 booted into BASIC. It's booted into asking you to enter some sort of software. And you can see that it came with a tape drive, and the tape drive in the X1 was fully logic controlled, so it would automatically start running software from tape if you had a tape in it. And very beautiful machine, as you can see, it comes in this striking red. Unfortunately, my red X1 does not work yet. It has a faulty power supply, and the belts on the tape drive are broken. But I have an X1 Turbo, which came in 1984. And it added a new graphics mode, 640 by 400, called the high resolution mode. It wasn't extensively used for games, but it could be used for application software. Then in 1986 came the X1 Turbo Z, and it had all the features of the X1 Turbo, which also had dual disk drives, but it added the Yamaha OPM FM sound chip. So Yamaha was doing all right for itself because it was selling these sound chips to everyone. They all upgraded to FM sound, they all used Yamaha chips. And but the hardware otherwise was the same. The CPU speed didn't change, and it stayed more or less that way throughout. And then in 1987, the X1 Twin, probably the most desirable version, which combined the Turbo Z with the NEC PC engine, which is completely bizarre if you think about it. NEC had their own line of home computers, and they had the game console that was named after them, the PC engine, but now they were willing to license it to Sharp to sell with their X1 computer. One reason could be that they were not really afraid of Sharp because the X1 wasn't a success. The NEC PC-88 more or less dominated the 8-bit computer market. Of course, there's the MSX that we need to talk about, but aside from that, it was the most popular system. And the PC-88 was notable, for example, for getting Hideo Kojima started, for getting Enix, Squaresoft, and all the legendary companies they started off releasing for the PC-88. And also one of the companies that released for the PC-88 and the X1 was Nintendo. They provided ports of Balloon Fight and even Super Mario Brothers for the X1, but the X1 version of Super Mario Brothers does not feature scrolling. And as you can imagine, it's not great if the screen doesn't scroll, but it's playable, more or less. But like back in the day, this wasn't a thing. They didn't think much about it because they thought it was a different market. And this is also one of the features of the Japanese home computer market, because the game systems were already there, the Famicom, the Sega systems, and so on. And they were not thought to be in direct competition. The computers were sold to a different market, whereas in the Western world, you could just dump your Atari 2600 and buy a C64. In Japan, you'd probably be looking for another type of experience if you bought a Pasokon instead of a game console. And these were expensive systems compared to the game consoles, and it showed in a lot of things. These were high-spec things, because you can imagine that in 1986 you had a system with dual floppy drives, FM sound, all the things, and we were just loading games off cassette here in Finland. So these were impressive systems, nevertheless, although they were not that successful. And I have videos. And this is the port of Xevious from 1984, the year when the X1 Turbo came out. And as you can see, this system is not a fan of scrolling either, but it does it better than the PC-88. This is clearly a system designed with games in mind, whereas on the PC-88 they were sort of an afterthought. And the game, again, I need to commend all of the ports on these systems for their very high playability. Even if it might look sluggish, you don't feel it when you're playing it. And it plays really well and looks authentic, arcade, not arcade perfect, but arcade faithful, you can say. And one of the reasons that's the case is that you can see the text program arranged by Dempa, Microsoft. They were a legendary developer that came up with a lot of great arcade ports. They knew what they were doing regardless of the system. And this port of Galaga from 1981 is also by them. And when you sort of compare and contrast this to the PC-88, you see that this system has a bit of an edge in terms of technological prowess. The graphics look neater. There are no lines. There's no need for dithering. It seems that the colors are crisp. And again, once you put in the FM sound, which not all games support, but some do, you get a very nice experience with your gaming. The X1, it's not as common as the PC-88, but it can still be found if you look on Yahoo auctions and so forth, and you can expect to pay for around 100 euros, 150 for a working system, but many of them have some sort of problems. Of course, the belts on the tape drive, they go bad, they snap. The power supplies may fail, these sorts of common issues. But when you take it apart, you can see that it's very well built. It's like very well designed, and there's even an expansion bus. So, for example, if you have the X1 Turbo, you can put in an FM soundboard and make it equal to the X1 Turbo Z. Of course, then you need a mixer. The Turbo Z came with a hardware mixer to mix the PSG sound with the FM sound. And again, the PSG itself is not a bad sound chip, but FM was the way to go in Japan in the late 80s. And some of the music is very nice. And like I said, let's let Gradius be the benchmark, and this is the X1 port of Gradius from 1986. And it looks slightly better than on the PC-88, but again, gameplay is identical. It plays very much the same, and both are enjoyable. But I like the graphics in this one, but then the sound on the PC-88 is better, because this does not yet have FM sound, whereas the PC-88 had that as standard. It never had a PSG sound chip. But and it's also notable that these systems all have 2-button joysticks. It's useful in games like these. No reaching for the space bar like we did on the old Commodore. But here you can see the use of color in this game. It's slightly improved over the PC-88 version. Overall, it's nice. So you had better games, but you had much fewer games, because most of the software came out on the 88. Some came out on all three, the Fujitsu FM7, the X1, and the PC-88, but most came out on the PC-88 alone. So this was the status quo in 1986. But then in 1987, Sharp decided to do the most over-engineered thing. I'm not sure what motivated the decision, but they wanted to build a system that could compete on specifications with anything that was out there, including the Commodore Amiga, as much as I love that system. This was a crazy beast. It came out in 1987 with a 10 megahertz Motorola 68000 processor, a megabyte of RAM, which could be expanded up to 8 on the standard system, actually 10. But then the graphics modes, you had resolutions up to 1024 by 1024, between 16 and 65,000 colors. You had hardware scrolling, 128 sprites with superimposed bitmap planes on top of each other. You had an 8-channel FM sound, again from Yamaha. You had a stereo digital to analog converter. You had a separate Oki chip for 80 PCM sound. You had a SCSI controller, or on the earlier versions it was a SCSI controller. It was everything. And it used 3 different refresh rates. You could run it as 15 kilohertz, 24, and 31 kilohertz, which of course made the screens very costly. But the system itself was also very expensive. At the time, it was the price of 2 and change Amiga 500s, and you could get like a dozen Sega Mega Drives for the price. So this was an exclusive system designed for the enthusiast, but we also need to take into account that the standard of living in Japan was extremely high in the late 80s, and those who wanted in on this hobby, they had the means and they had the will to pay for a very good system. And this is what they got. It received 2 updates. Again, there are like these minor revisions along the way. But in 1991, the X68016, which runs at 16 megahertz, came out. Then there was a version called the Red Zone, which went even a bit higher. And then in 1993, the final version came out, the X68030, which had the Motorola 68030 at 25 megahertz. And you can also upgrade the system. Turbo cards came out for this system, much like for the Amiga. You can go up to an 060, even though it's not really helping you in terms of compatibility, but you can do that. Most games, however, were designed for the 10 megahertz 68000. So if you're just into games, that's the system to go to. And here we see the 2 models side by side, the 68000 Expert on the right and the 68030 on the left. And this was not the initial model. The first one, it was gray, but the black one then came out a bit later. And we had the Pro version, which had a horizontal case, actually more expansion slots. You could put 4 in those, whereas you had only 2 expansion slots on the standard system, as if you wanted to expand. But yeah, you could put in a SCSI card, you could put in a MIDI card, you could put in extra RAM, and what have you. Starting off with Gradius from 1987, and you can see sort of the leap ahead in terms of how much this looks like the arcade game. A lot of the ports for the X68000, they were designed to look very much like the arcade, up to the point where they ask you to insert coin. This, of course, was meant to give you the sort of the idea that they were the actual arcade versions. Mostly they were not. They were ports, but they were very good ports. And for example, Capcom, they used the X68000 as the basis for their CPS arcade hardware. So they looked at the 68K and said, okay, it has to be at least as good as this. And so that's why it became the development tool for them. And if you think about what we got around the same time in the West, this is in a league of its own in many respects, and the sound is also very nice. And if that's not enough for you, then a lot of the games have MIDI support, and you can just play your Roland MT32 or SC55 in the background for even nicer audio. Super Hang-On, just as an example of a Sega Superscaler game, so in the sort of vein of Outrun, Space Harrier and so on. There was no port of Outrun, but there was a port of Super Hang-On, and that gives you an idea of what Outrun might have looked like on this system, and it would have looked like this, which I find to be very nice, even though I suck at this game. But you can see that there's none of the typical things you would see in the Western conversions, the blinking road, the pop-up graphics and so on. It looks very much like the arcade game and plays very much like it as well. And this was the norm in a lot of ways. And the next one is also, yeah, this is not an arcade game. This is a port. Sorry, not a port, but it's an original development by Famibe no Yoshin, and it's a hobbyist game from 1995, so very late in the system's life, called Chorensha. The capture is not perfect because it runs in 31 kilohertz, so it got a bit squished, but you'll see what I'm getting at. Nevertheless, it's a very quick shooter game, very responsive, runs very beautifully, and this is why the X68000 is such a cult system in the West. Even it was one of the first ones to gain this sort of recognition, and is still a very popular system for hobbyists, and the prices reflect that. These are quite expensive systems to acquire. If you have a working X68K, you can expect to pay 700-800 euros for a system. If it's an 030, one of the higher end ones, well past 1,000 euros for a good one. But you get an invitation to this exclusive club of people who get to play these beautiful arcade perfect, almost arcade perfect ports that were unheard of in our hemisphere at that time. And it's a really impressive, nice, well thought out system, except for one thing. The OS is not great. It runs a system called Human 68K, Human OS, and it's like a CP/M MS-DOS relative for the 68000. And also there's a window system, a graphical user interface known as the SX window. And neither of those are really needed much because the games are usually made to boot from floppy, or if you put in a hard drive, you can just use a hobbyist hard drive image that has a lot of games installed. You don't need to use those for anything, but if you do, it's like a slightly poorer version of DOS. And I think it would have benefited from a better OS in that respect. But what I think really kept it out of the Western market was the price. It had so many features that were really needed to do this arcade game stuff, and also for the Japanese characters and so on. And it would have been fairly prohibitive to try to sell them over here, especially at that time. But they were not the most popular systems in Japan. We'll get to what was, but it was there was a market. It sold, and the people who loved it, they were very much like the fans of the Amiga, who also loved their system a lot and continue tweaking it to this day. Another crazy great system from around the same time, the Fujitsu FM Towns. So Fujitsu had the FM7, the FM77, and then some business machines that ran CPM, MS-DOS, and so on. But NEC was on that market very much with the PC98, and they were having a hard time competing with them. So they also decided to go all out and build a really crazy system. And in 1989, they came out with the FM Towns. And then the towns in the name, it's not about the towns as in cities, but it's about the Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Towns, which actually is spelled with an E, but they wanted to leave that out because then they would fear that the name would get pronounced Townies or whatnot. Confusing, convoluted, but anyway. So the first one came out in 1989. It was a Intel-based system, and also they used also AMD chips. But anyway, 386 SX at 16 megahertz with 2 megabytes of RAM, expandable again. It also had a lot of graphics modes from 320 by 200 to 720 by 512, up to 32,000 colors from 16 million. So although the X68K had more colors, this had a larger palette, so the end result was indistinguishable. 1,024 sprites, sprite layer, bitmap overlays, all the things. So a lot of the overlay stuff was anyway needed to display the characters correctly, but it could also be used to some great effect in games. And it had a massive sound chip, the Ricoh, with 8 PCM channels, and again the Yamaha OPN2 6-channel FM sound. Also, very notable thing, it was the first computer in the world to have a CD-ROM drive as standard and to be able to boot from that. And how they managed that was impressive. What they did was they had a minimal MS-DOS in ROM, and all that would do was boot up, then load MS-CD extensions, and then boot from CD. And most games will boot directly from the CD. Some require a floppy in addition to the CD in order to boot. But the notable thing is that most FM Town systems had no hard drive. Because you would think that if the system is otherwise this impressive, of course it will have a massive hard drive as well. And of course they had SCSI controllers. But a lot of the systems that you find secondhand, they don't have hard drives because it's really not needed if you're just mostly using ready-made software. Not even games alone. If you can save your work on floppy disks, then you don't need the hard drive for anything. In 1993, they decided to capitalize on the potential for games, and they consoleized the system, created the FM Towns Marty, and it's basically the first system just in a very compact format with a CD drive, floppy drive, and VHS output. And then in 1995, they had the FMV Towns, and this was the end of the line for the system. So it was a standard PC, but it came with an expansion card that contained the original FM Towns hardware. So you could switch it over to FM Towns mode, and then it would run off the card. So basically it was just not an emulator, it was a full hardware implementation of the original Towns. And it was a Pentium system. Between these models, they introduced a lot of different ones. There were FM Towns, pure FM Towns models based on the 486, and some even on the Pentium. But how they did that was they used a 486 motherboard, and then they used a Pentium overdrive CPU to upgrade it to Pentium. And of course, this incurs a performance hit, but it didn't matter that much because most of the FM Towns' software was anyway written for the 386 and the SX. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But despite the number of models, despite the developments, this also was not a hugely popular system. Again, there were sales, and there was a lot of hype about this, even in the West, but it never made its breakthrough. Again, the reason quite probably was that it was very expensive. I think it was even more than the X68K. But it looks so beautiful. This is the Model 2F. It looks identical to the first model, save for some differences on the front panel. And it came with its own display because it also uses the tri-sync system. It has different refresh rates. And the CD-ROM, because they wanted to emphasize that this is the first system with a CD-ROM, they put it front and center. And they made huge efforts to make it as cheap, of course, as possible, which has sort of backfired later on, because as these get old, the drive motors wear down and they no longer spin the disc properly. It's quite heavy to spin the disc when it's upright like that. And usually some brands of CDR do not work properly. You need lighter ones, and these sorts of problems appear later on when an FM Town system gets old. But when new, it looked astonishing, and it's also a royal pain to take apart, because you have to unscrew just one little screw, then the whole thing comes apart like a jigsaw puzzle. But it's a very difficult puzzle. I don't recommend it for first-timers. But when it works and it's presented like that, it looks gorgeous. And I have games for you. The New Zealand Story, 1989, from Ving, which was one of the better porters of arcade things. And those familiar with the New Zealand Story can surely appreciate that this is more or less just like the original arcade game. I'm not saying it's arcade perfect. I don't have expert player knowledge, but it's very impressive. And the fun thing about the FM Towns is that you can, of course, have even the very original arcade soundtrack, because you can play audio off CD. Fujitsu made a big point about this. And in many games, like Marble Madness, for example, which was an Atari System 1 game from I think 1984 or something like that, they not only made an arcade perfect looking conversion, they had all the soundtrack, the entire soundtrack re-recorded in Redbook audio by like an orchestral arrangement. And they did this a lot. And it gives you a great audio track. Of course, if you're not into that thing, you want the original one, it will just bother you. But if you like it, then it's beautiful. The New Zealand Story has the original arcade sounds. The second one, and another game I suck at, is Afterburner, which we also have here at the Finnish Museum of Games. And this is also something that looked mightily impressive in 1989, because the number of stuff, the amount of stuff, the volume of stuff on the screen is very impressive. The planes just keep coming, the landscape just keeps coming, everything scales like crazy towards you. And this is one game where the home computer versions in the West failed, because they couldn't reproduce the feeling of speed, the massive thing that was the main point about the entire game. And this could very comfortably do that with all of its sprite trickery and zooming and scaling and so on. But we, of course, need to contrast and compare. I think the X68000, in a way, it was even more powerful in terms of pure graphics manipulation. But if you add the CD capabilities of the FM Towns and the fact that it has slightly more processing power, it made it a bit more of a robust system. And again, FM Towns doesn't have Outrun, it has Turbo Outrun, but Chase Headquarters is a nice racing game that shows you what the system can do. And it's not arcade perfect in terms of gameplay. The intersections are different, and it's much easier. But as you can see, this is a far cry from the home computer versions in the West, and also features the full soundtrack and so on. And I'll get to that later, but the reason I'm showing you arcade games, of course, is that I don't speak Japanese very well. A lot of the games that are sort of the strategy games, the adventure games and so on, you need expert understanding of Japanese to be able to really enjoy them. But FM Towns, as it was almost a PC, received ports from the Western IBM PC games. So you have Stunts, 4D driving, you have Life and Death, Dungeon Master, things like this, because it was close enough to where the porting effort wasn't like, it wasn't too massive. The FM Towns, it ran two different types of OS. It had, of course, the minimal MS-DOS. It could run a special version of Microsoft Windows. And the later models, they could, of course, run straight Windows. Then you could run other stuff in the FM Towns mode. But then they had a separate graphical user interface known as the Towns OS, which had a file manager and could launch software. That was the default experience. But these were sort of bordering on the DOS thing. They were not DOS compatible, but many of them ran a sort of compatible version. You couldn't run the same binaries, but you could do a lot of the same operations, and of course you could leverage the file systems and so on from the others. But again, the FM Towns, it wasn't a resounding success. It was costly, of course. But I think, of course, being from a single vendor, no matter how good it was difficult to compete with MS-DOS, and in Japan, especially with the NEC PC98, which we'll get to next, because that was the system to own. The reasons for that are various, but I think both Sharp and Fujitsu, they had to compete by choosing an angle that NEC wasn't using, whereas they tried to sell to the enthusiasts. And that, of course, it's never going to be as big of a market as the sort of the common standard user market. But you can find FM Town systems in the wild still. The tower models, when you look up Yahoo Japan, I mean, they come up like every now and then, and the prices range from, let's say, 50 euros for a somewhat broken system to 200-300 for a working one. And the Towns Marty is the most expensive one, surprisingly, except for the FMV Towns, which is very rare and desirable. But the Towns Marty is desirable because it's a very compact system and it allows you to enjoy most of the games. Also because there's an optical drive emulator available for that called the Doc Brown. So it's a very nice modding project as well. But you can expect to pay about 1,000 euros for a Towns Marty, and similar money or more for an FMV Towns. But if you really want to just play the games, I recommend you go for the tower model and sort out the problems, and then you have a system that didn't cost an arm and a leg, and you can play most of the games on that as well. And again, many different variants, different CPUs. There's a desktop model, then these other tower models with 386, the SX, and I think and you can swap that over to a 486 and so on, but most of the games are designed for fairly low spec original models. And we'll finish off with what everyone else was competing against, the NEC PC98. And NEC had the sort of a two-pronged strategy wherein they wanted to sell the PC88 to the home computer hobbyists, and then the PC98 to businesses. And as time moved on, these lines became sort of converged, and the PC98 started selling to homes. They decided to start upgrading it with sound and better graphics and so on. And it started attracting the game developers simply because of the sheer number of units that were out there. Again, there are so many models of the PC98 that I've only collected some of them here. But in 1982, so only a year after the PC88, we had the 9801 with the 8086 at 5 megahertz, 128 kilobytes of RAM, and 640 by 400 at 8 colors, again for the special characters. In 85, you had the VF, which had the graphic charger, improved the selection of colors, and also upgraded the CPU to 8 megahertz. Then the UV in 86 added the FM sound. The VX upgraded to 286, 10 megahertz, with the enhanced graphic charger at 16 colors. And between these, there were dozens of models. There's so many PC98, it's absolutely crazy. In 1992, you had the 9821 with 386 SX, 3 and change megabytes of RAM, and a CD-ROM as standard. But by that time, the FM Towns had been out for 3 years already. Then just to proceed along, in 1997, we were up to Pentium MMX, and then we had a DVD decoder, TV tuner, CD-ROM, all the things, and the final system was a Celeron 433 in the year 2000. And like I said, dozens of different SKUs between this, and also 2 clone manufacturers, Seiko Epson, they made clones of the 9801, and ASD Research, they made a hybrid system which was IBM PC compatible and PC98 compatible. And here's Magical Block Karat as an example of a PC98 game, typical in a lot of ways. It's not scrolling oriented. The system doesn't do it very well, so just static screens, please. And then it also features nice anime, manga graphics. This is because of the intersection of the cultures of anime manga enthusiasts and also the computer enthusiasts. And that would be a topic for another presentation. So I won't go that much further into that. But as you can see, nice graphics above EGA standards and very nice use of dithering to create a very nice picture. And some of the motivation for playing this game comes from seeing the pretty pictures of the girls later on. But these sorts of puzzle games were very popular. And as I mentioned, there were also ports from IBM PC to the PC98 due to reasons of hardware similarity. The PC98 was not hardware compatible in any way. The expansion bus was different, the arrangement of the CPU and RAM and so on, they were different, but they were just similar enough so that you could do some porting. And in my experience, this is recorded from the RX model, 286 at 12 megahertz, and it runs a bit better than my old PC IBM compatible at the same clock speed.